Hi everyone. Thanks for tuning in today, and I'm really excited to talk about a book that I only decided to read about a week ago, but that I finished incredibly quickly, at least for my standards. Because the Screwtape letters by C.S. Lewis is hands down one of the best things I've read this year. I want to say thanks to Davood Gozli for the recommendation, and definitely check out his channel if you haven't already. He talks there about books and psychology and the intersection of the two, and I'll link it below in case you want to check it out. You might recognize C.S. Lewis as the author of the children's series, including The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. While those books could be enjoyed alone as stories, they also contain plenty of biblical parallels because Lewis, as a Catholic Christian, really focused most of his writings, including the Screwtape letters, on exploring Christianity through a lens of rationality, often also putting his works classified within the realm of apologetics, or that is, the rational defense of the Catholic faith. This wasn't the first time this book was recommended to me. I know that its work often cited by Christian thinkers, very influential, but picking up a book about theology feels like it requires me to adopt a certain mindset of seriousness and focus that basically prevented me for a while from taking it on because I wasn't really mentally ready or just not quite in the mindset to really focus on it. That concern, it turns out, was mostly unfounded because while this is an unquestionably serious book in its subject matter, which deals not just with Christianity, but really more fundamentally with topics of morality and personal growth, the way the discussion is framed makes it a hugely entertaining read. Now, before you navigate away, you might have heard Christian theology and tuned out if you're not a Christian, but unlike some more esoteric works of Christian theology, this one feels general enough in the topics it explores that I'd recommend it not just for Christians, but for anyone who's interested in a bit of self-reflection. You might not agree with every conclusion that C.S. Lewis draws, many of which are deeply rooted in Christianity or more specifically in the Catholic faith, but I can pretty much guarantee that much of it will resonate with you as it did for me. I should mention that I'm going to keep this review mostly a secular discussion rather than taking the tenets of Christianity or Catholicism as a given, which I hope will make it more accessible, but I would encourage you to check out some of the more overtly religious perspectives out there on this book, since there are plenty such videos I found on YouTube, and I think you'll also find that different parts of the book stand out the most for people who are approaching this book from a different perspective. So like I said, there's plenty of valuable content in here for hopefully just about anyone. For example, I've been pretty seriously exploring the practice of mindfulness and meditation for the past half year or so, and reading a little bit about it as well. That's something I could talk about in another video though, but I found that the attitudes of non-judgment and acceptance that one tries to cultivate through mindfulness are excellent foundations for living and have already helped me to navigate days or circumstances that feel tumultuous or unexpected at the time. And I was excited when reading this book to see just how many parallels I noticed between the principles of mindfulness I've been working on and the principles that C.S. Lewis advocates in this book. Or maybe I should say the principles that C.S. Lewis advocates against in this book, because getting more to the specifics now, in this book, Lewis is literally playing devil's advocate. The Screwtape letters are written as correspondence from a senior-ranking devil named Screwtape, working under, Satan, to his junior nephew Wormwood, advising the latter on how to tempt his new patient, as they call them, into sin. So Lewis basically takes this idea where each of us has a devil and an angel sitting on either one of our shoulders and explores a person's life from the point of view of that devil. And the Screwtape letters are presented as basically these scandalous classified documents that have somehow been leaked to the author for publication. Something like the Watergate tapes or the Pentagon Papers, like the Screwtape letters. In fact, this very premise of correspondence between the devils might be one of the most difficult concepts for actual Christians to grasp, because here in his humor, Lewis makes the experience of being inside of the mind of a devil feel almost fun, for a while at least. Although in one of the letters, Screwtape makes clear that the somewhat comical image of a devil as a horned red being in tights is not what devils actually are, and is helpful for the devils actually because it makes humans take them less seriously. This very correspondence and the humor with which it's written will likely be a bit unsettling if you actually believe that demons and hell are real and not to be taken lightly. In fact, this is one way in which the book might feel a little bit easier for secular audiences who can take this portrayal merely as a moral metaphor. Still, one merit to the way that Lewis does this book is that if you cultivate the virtues he's hinting at in this book, I guess there's no reason why you shouldn't feel at least some sort of empathy, even for a devil. It doesn't mean that you should admire the devils, but I guess you can at least feel sorry for them in a way. I don't know. But anyway, that isn't really what this book is about, and it's not what stood out to me most. So moving on. This book is so brilliant because the methods that the devils employ run counter to what you would first expect. I kind of assumed that the devils here would be pretty transparent, like trying to convince their patients to rob a bank or cheat on their loyal and loving spouses. That, though, is not the approach the devils take. In fact, a sin so egregious is something that the devils would likely try to avoid encouraging it, at least for a while, because it's so obvious that it might encourage self-reflection and even repentance. Instead, C.S. Lewis places his eye on the things that many of us do every day that we think are good. In fact, we think they are so good that we become complacent or even proud of them, and maybe even start to feel superior to others for how good, wise, or enlightened we are. Even something like attending the Catholic Mass weekly is, though not to be encouraged, something the devils use to their advantage in the hopes that they can get their patient to believe that this is enough and that no actual acts of kindness or humility are really required to be a good person. More than anything, the devils try to encourage extreme, absolute, and uncritical views of oneself and the world. For example, when war breaks out in Europe, the devils are less sanguine about the war itself, which often leads to very undesirable developments such as selfless acts of heroism or making personal sacrifices for the general good of one's countrymen. They instead aim to make their patient either an avowed patriot or a radical pacifist. It doesn't matter to them at all which. You see, while they recognize that there's some danger to them in a restrained patriotism, or especially in a pacifism grounded in deeper values and convictions, they're confident that, as they find is usually the case, they can convince their patient to become attached to pacifism simply as a cause, so that he can think of himself as superior for his embodiment of this ideal, and so that basically he can direct all the energy embodied in pacifism towards the abstract other person, without implementing any practical changes affecting those nearest to him in his own life. And this is a huge point Lewis is making here, one that challenged me in an important way. Lewis's interpretation of Christian life, or more generally of moral life, that he embodies in this book, contains a heavy dose of pragmatism, focused on the here and now of morality, still without losing sight of the more eternal and spiritual dimensions of the faith. He cautions against the danger of getting caught up in the abstract, that which we can't fully grasp, whether it's a spiritual concept like eternity or a more immediate one like world peace. Now, I should point out here that this leaves some room for what is, in my opinion, a bit of a misinterpretation. I've seen some videos by seemingly more conservative readers, and it's kind of just the nature of this book that it's more commonly read by religious conservatives. I've seen people cite these passages in a way that not only criticizes the liberals for taking pride in these lofty goals like pacifism and progressive causes and everything, which I do think that Lewis is trying to criticize in a certain way here, but then they also discuss these passages as if Lewis is saying that it's not worth bothering to pursue such goals at all. He's not, at least as far as I can tell. He's just saying that this alone should not be the point of pride or the period at the end of the sentence. We shouldn't neglect to be involved in the broader causes or forget entirely about the idea of the abstract other, the people around the world that we never interact with directly. At least how I interpreted it, what he's saying is rather that attaching ourselves to such causes in the abstract should be a higher level of our moral development and requires a lot more attention and skill than the lower levels, like loving one's actual neighbor or family members, which should be practiced first and serves as an excellent training ground or scaffolding to build upon for the higher levels. But I guess one possible downside of the Screwtape letters as a work is that, like, I don't know, the U.S. Constitution, it often can be hard to interpret what Lewis is actually saying, and we're all bound to pick and choose the parts that resonate with us the most. As such, maybe all of us, myself included, risk missing the points that Lewis most wanted us to hear. Still, Lewis's arguments in this book really did speak to me, even outside of their religious motivations. As I reflected on various stages of my own moral development, as I see it, Lewis really hits upon this tendency of humans to compare ourselves with others, and in doing so, to actually undermine our own growth and even foster a certain resentment that stifles compassion. Now, I want to be totally clear before I explore my own path a bit further that I don't mean to suggest that my moral development has been the correct one or that this is the only way it could move for someone, especially since, as you'll see, Lewis himself probably would have agreed with some aspects of my path, but still probably wouldn't be too thrilled about where I am right now in a more strictly theological sense. So I'm just going to explore my path for the sake of example, but I think to some extent we all have to be just personally honest with ourselves about where we are and where we're going, and to do our best to see through the ways that we trick ourselves into complacency. And I'm sure there are many such ways in which I still do just that. Anyway, I personally grew up Christian, specifically Catholic, through high school, and my morality was a religious, fairly conservative mentality. not in any extreme or fundamentalist sense, but in the sense that it stemmed from a few accepted core laws and values defined within the religion, but then built upon them mainly through a rational framework, albeit one guided by the church leadership. In college, though, I started noticing more disagreements I had with some of the laws of the church, some things that I found to be contradictions or simply non-intuitive, and therefore I began to deviate a bit from my childhood upbringing and kind of started tweaking my system of morality to something that was still not hugely different and still was largely inspired by my childhood values rooted in Christianity, but where everything had to be justified purely on a grounds of rationality. I started leaning a little bit more to the left politically too, and although I never really felt alienated from the more conservative or more religious communities such as the ones I came from, I often did see this alienation appearing within many of my new friends and peers at the university, and I did sometimes feel among them and even myself a new sense of, I guess you could say, righteousness, and that we had moved beyond this earlier, more stifling or ignorant mentality as we saw it into a moral system that was still rational and, for me at least, was not too different, but was more sound and justified in my own mind. And I would remain confident in some of my newer, more politically and, I guess, morally also left-leaning conclusions, but at some point I started feeling discouraged by the way many people around me conceived of this stage of their development, if you want to call it that. Again, I don't mean to imply here that moving from conservative to liberal is necessarily a stage of moral maturing. I just mean that for myself and those around me, we conceived of it that way. I became frustrated, though, with the sense of moral superiority often espoused by people calling themselves liberals, grounded in their rationality as compared with the ignorance or backwardness or bigotry of conservatives, which to me was kind of just a different hue of the same moral superiority I often saw from people on the right, who were grounded in their faith as compared with the worldliness or the secularism or the hedonism of liberals. It appeared to me that often being a liberal fighting for the right causes as determined by society, mostly social justice causes, was for many people the end of the road, like the final stage in development. So gradually over the next 5 or more years, I found myself still leaning liberal on political issues, but kind of mentally distancing myself politically and morally from this crowd of, in my eyes, misguided and somewhat clueless people with no actual concept of how a conservative person or a religious person thinks or views the world. And I even came to find that liberals' arguments in philosophy, though grounded in different principles and not justified on the basis of religious commandments, were nevertheless still pretty arbitrary at the very root. For example, many people consider individual autonomy or minimization of suffering as the core goals on which every value is rooted, if you really get to the bottom of it, which I think is that I find sensible, but also I find them harder to prove that they are the ultimate good, despite trying harder and harder. For example, at least as Lewis argues in this book, the idea that all suffering is bad and to be avoided at all costs is a great misconception of humanity, an idea that at this point, at least to some extent, I agree with, though I certainly think that reduction of avoidable suffering is an admirable goal. All of this is just to say, though, that I began to take true pride in myself as being an independent thinker, one who could relate with both sides of the political spectrum, not closed-minded like the conservative people who never explore the roots of their convictions beyond what's told in the faith, nor closed-minded like the liberal people who view all conservatives as bigots or fools, with seemingly no real concept of how a conservative actually views the world. And I took some pride in developing these sort of intermediate stances on things, and always trying to explore both sides of the argument, a practice that I've always enjoyed and still value enormously. But, as you'll notice from the way that I've described this identity, a lot of that identity still is grounded in who I see that I am not, rather than who I am. My sense of identification with conservatives comes at least partly from how, like them, I can see the foolishness of this simplistic and caricaturized version of liberals, and vice versa. And that is really where this book comes in, because there is an excellent letter here in which Uncle Screwtape describes to his protege Wormwood that they want to drive their patient into precisely this situation, one in which he thinks that he is able to understand and empathize with everyone, but in reality he's simply bonding over a dislike or a resentment or frustration that he harbors towards absolutely everyone. He wants the patient to conceive of himself as a rare person who, alone and by his own merit, is really wise or really understands things in a way that other narrow-minded people around him don't. And although this isn't how I'd like to view the world, I often catch myself in sort of this kind of mindset. And I suspect we all do sometimes, regardless of where we've been in our moral development and where we're still going. Feeling a sense of, I know the truth, and these other people out there they just don't get it. We're subconsciously relying on our critiques of others to boost ourselves up. And yes, it's kind of just human nature, which is why Lewis bothered to explore it in this book. I also should probably clarify after that last statement, like, I have a positive view of other people in general, and I don't really, in general, think of everyone else as a fool or anything like this. That's not really the point. My understanding is just that sometimes I do see elements of this tendency in myself to try to build myself up by, I guess, I don't know what to call it other than a little bit of a sense of superiority that I'm not proud of at all, but that is just, I think it's human nature. Hopefully that makes some amount of sense and I'm not just coming across as a totally terrible person. Where should I be aiming towards, though? Well, to start out, just not considering myself at the end of the road, keeping in mind that anyone else out there might fairly call me a fool as well. Having a real humility without undermining that humility by letting it become a point of pride. Even better, though, connecting with others not through enmity, but through true empathy. Even if it did turn out that I'd reached the end of the road, that I'd made it to the pinnacle of moral development, enlightenment, whatever you want to call it, we have to work with everyone where they are. And I think a huge part of that consists of legitimizing, understanding, and empathizing with others' experiences, regardless of whether we think that these perceptions are the right ways of viewing the world. It consists of figuring out how to work with others, not against them, and in a positive sense, rather than working with them simply in our opposition to someone else, or working with them to, figure out the error of their ways. And this all probably sounds kind of vague, and I admit I don't really know how to approach my own moral development, or with it, the common mutual moral development of humanity as a species, but I'm at least somewhat convinced that at its core, it's going to require true empathy and humility, so maybe that's at least a starting point. And hopefully it's one that C.S. Lewis would endorse too, even if we disagree on the exact details of how to get there. And in fact, that is just one of the many moral or personal themes of this book I enjoyed. Within other of Screwtape's nefarious letters, I found wisdom about how to be charitable in my communications with others, how to skillfully navigate the peaks and troughs of existence, how to experience my everyday emotions in less of a biased way, one in which I acknowledge their realness while also giving them the appropriate weight, knowing that they will change sooner than I expect, and that fundamentally feeling positive emotions or negative emotions is not something we have complete control of, and does not make us a good or bad person in any sense. And there's plenty more out there that's worth considering too. Maybe one last thing worth pondering, though, is how the end game of the ideals espoused in this book differs for someone approaching this book from a secular versus a religious perspective. If you're a Catholic reading this book, you can rest satisfied that resisting temptations and being a good person is worthwhile no matter how difficult it is, because it will bring you to heaven, which is the ultimate reward. If you don't believe in heaven, on the other hand, then is it still worth being a good person in the way that Lewis advocates here? This is where I would argue, yes, it is. But if so, the reward has to be something more inherent. Perhaps following these principles is actually comforting in itself, or helps us to better balance our most immediate desires with our long-term, even if not eternally long-term, aspirations. And this notion overlaps with other non-Christian religious or spiritual notions as well. For example, Screwtape's advice to always try to convince the patient to focus on the future, or if not the future, the past, really anything but the present. That is highly reminiscent to me of how mindfulness meditation attempts to focus on the present and view future and past only through that lens of the present. Goodness, as Lewis describes it, runs deeper than just doing good deeds and not doing bad deeds. It's a mindset that we have to continually cultivate. But at the end of the day, goodness, in some sense, however we define it, for secular people has to be its own reward, which is something that I wholeheartedly believe is true. But I realize that part of why this book works so well for me is because Lewis is, for the most part, describing things that I already hold to be true. By contrast, if your idea of what is moral and immoral, if you even have such an idea at all, is very different from his to begin with, he doesn't really intend to provide arguments for why you should adopt such a moral code in the first place. It's just not really his goal here. Wrapping things up, though, I found this simply an excellent book, and one that I think would be worthwhile for many Christians and non-Christians to read. These letters are strongest in the sense that they allow us to see ourselves within them and question the way we view the world. And I suspect that this book is going to have a significant long-term influence on me in this sense. I realize I didn't tackle the more strictly theological or Christianity-specific aspects of Lewis's work in this review because I think there are plenty of good discussions out there on this by people who are better informed on the topic than me, so check them out if you're interested. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear me talk about a whole bunch of other books selected nearly at random. And until next time, bye, and happy reading.